Senator Cruz, thank you so very much for taking time out of your day. This is, as they say, this has been a storm of biblical proportions, hasn't it?
Well, it truly has. It's good to be with you, Mike. The devastation we're dealing with in Texas, it's still ongoing. We're still seeing flooding. My hometown of Houston has been underwater now for 4 days as the flooding continues to pound. And in the face of this massive storm, and we're looking at 500-year floods right now. What we're also seeing are incredible stories of heroism. Mm-hmm. We're seeing first responders, firefighters, and police officers, and EMS, and National Guardsmen, and Coast Guardsmen, and just ordinary citizens stepping up and saving their neighbors. We've had over 7,000 high water rescues, and so it is a huge challenge, and yet at the same time it's inspiring seeing Texans coming together, helping other Texans.
People remember how the state of Texas opened its heart and doors and homes to those affected by Katrina. And I've heard that theme a lot over the last 48 hours, that just as Texas did everything it could to help those who were displaced by Katrina, now it's time to help Texas. I hear that rallying cry all throughout the country, Senator.
Well, thank you, and we are seeing an outpouring of support and prayers and love from across the country. I think the count is now 14 states have sent search and rescue assets and teams. Louisiana has sent the Cajun Navy, which we appreciate their being part of the rescue efforts.
Right.
And we're also seeing a coordinated response from the local and state and federal government levels, all working together, just with the top priority being the preservation of life right now, saving those who are imperiled by rising floodwaters. And
it feels different this time, doesn't it, Senator? It does seem as if that coordination, which certainly was lacking during Katrina, that coordination between city, county, state, federal, it seems like this is operating more efficiently this time around. Am I right?
Well, I think that is right, and I think we've got some very, very capable leaders at every level of government that are committed to working together. And so a couple of days ago, Governor Abbott signed an order setting up a joint command, state and federal, to direct the disaster relief. That's something that aids the coordination significantly because you don't have the conflicting lines of authority. And I'll tell you, a couple of days ago, right when the flooding had started in Houston, I heard from both Mayor Sylvester Turner and the county judge Ed Emmett that they did not have sufficient assets for the search and rescue, that the volume of flooding was so great that they didn't have enough boats and helicopters and high water trucks, and the calls to 911 were far greater than their capacity to serve them. And so I spent the better chunk of a day on the phone to federal officials and state officials working to mobilize those assets, and the governor stepped in and sent over 500 Texas DPS troopers to Houston. He called up and deployed over 3,000 National Guardsmen. He sent both boats and helicopters, and then at the federal government, we were able to mobilize assets, including Coast Guard assets and choppers for high water rescue, and even the Border Patrol sent up teams that have done experience in high water rescue, sent them up with boats and choppers and jet skis to pull people out of peril. But, Mike, the most amazing thing is on top of all of that, the local officials put out a call just to private citizens. If you have a flat-bottom boat, if you can help, we need your help. And we had hundreds upon hundreds call and volunteer. I was at the Harris County Emergency Command Center. There's an entire wall covered with Post-its just of names and numbers, and they acted as a switchboard where when someone was in peril, they would call a private citizen and say, okay, your neighbor's in trouble, can you get your boat to them?
Right.
And that's where many of these rescues have been carried out.
Senator, let's dive into the controversial issue of funding, and I know you've dealt with this before. You're a straight shooter, so I'm interested in your response to a lot of Northeastern lawmakers who are pushing back hard right now at you and Senator Cornyn for having opposed some of the pork that was in the spending and the relief for Superstorm Sandy. I'm reading from the Associated Press. It says here in the $60 billion of recovery, $47 billion was for immediate help for victims and other recovery and rebuilding efforts. Well, you don't have to be a mathematician then to see that over 12 or 13 billion was not. That, as I understand it, was your reason for opposing the way the spending bill looked back then. But now folks like Pete King and Chris Christie are calling you out, accusing you of hypocrisy because you're of course hoping for disaster relief on behalf of your constituents in Texas. How do you respond to that criticism, Senator?
I think it's unfortunate that we're seeing a handful of politicians jump into political sniping rather than simply coming together to deal with the natural disaster. I can tell you my focus is on preventing the loss of life here because we have people who are in crisis, whose families are threatened by the floodwaters, and if a few folks want to snipe or grandstand, they can make that decision. I can tell you when the Sandy vote was before Congress, a great many of us, myself included, said quite loudly and clearly that, of course, disaster relief was important. It was vital. It's a long-standing federal responsibility, and we needed to provide relief to the victims of Sandy. But what happened there is you saw a handful of politicians, interestingly, some of these same politicians who are spouting off now, who ended up larding the bill up. It was over $50 billion. And of that bill, only 30% of it was emergency spending. 70% of it was non-emergency spending over a long time. It included things like funding for Alaska fisheries. Mm-hmm. Now, the last I checked, Hurricane Sandy didn't come anywhere near Alaska. And so that was the reason for the opposition of a number of members. But we were clear at the time that hurricane funding and disaster relief is a critical priority. It was then and it is now. But the relief fund should be directed to the victims of the disaster.
And it seems clear that for consistency's sake, we better be sure there's not that the spending for the victims of Harvey doesn't get loaded up with a bunch of pork too, right?
Of course. Yeah. The proper, I think it's cynical for politicians to advantage for
doggone it.
Providing real relief to people who are the victims.
I'm sorry. We got a bad cell site, I think, and we lost Senator Cruz's cell connection. But if you can't hear me, Senator Cruz, thank you very, very much for spending some time with us here on the Mike Gallagher Show.